You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Bible. That's the book for me, Dr. G. Whoa. Welcome, everyone, to Polycarp's Paradigm. My name is Eric Robinson. I have Dr. Mark Giszczak back on the show. He talked to us in the fall about dark passages of Scripture. I just laid out the toughest questions I could think of with Scripture, and you handled them impeccably, Doctor. So thank you. And welcome back to the show. And you've done a lot of work on Bible translation, and you have another book hopefully coming out soon this year on the evolution of the English Standard Version Catholic Edition. And so I wanted you to share more about that story and all of that. And so first, just introduce yourself again to the listeners and how you got interested in Bible translation in the first place.
Sure. So, my name is Mark Giszczak, and I'm Associate Professor of Sacred Scripture here at the Augustine Institute. So, on a daily basis, I'm preparing for and teaching courses, master's courses in mainly Old Testament, but also a little bit of New Testament. So, earlier this week, I was lecturing on Ecclesiastes, and next week I think is Proverbs. So, wisdom literature is sort of my wheelhouse. I wrote my dissertation on the Song of Songs, and working right now on a book on the Book of Wisdom. So I'm hoping that will be done soon. But I'm not sure exactly where to begin here in terms of talking about the ESV Catholic Edition. But maybe one way is to just say, once upon a time, I was sitting in class and asked my professor, hey, what Bible translation do you recommend? And he said, well, there are a lot of translations out there, but there's this new one that came out pretty recently that I like called the English Standard Version. So that was back in 2005. So I picked up a copy of the ESV back then. I still have that copy.
Nice.
And I've been using it ever since. So, what's interesting about it, just from like a user standpoint, is it's an update of the RSV. And I was very familiar with the RSV. And I remember listening to the RSV. I remember in high school, I had a tape set of the New Testament RSV with, what's that guy's name? It's going to come to me in a minute, right? But he has like this deep, sonorous voice, reading the epistles.
James Earl Jones?
It's
Darth Vader?
Jones. He was a very like prominent actor for like the first round of Bible on tape. So he did a King James and an RSV and a couple other ones, I think, too. But anyway, I just remember the RSV, listening to that over and over again. So the ESV, it feels really familiar, right? Because it just sounds like the RSV, which is in that traditional English Bible translation tradition that begins really with the King James Version. You could trace it back a little further, but and so it sounds like the Bible. Some of these like new translations are really idiosyncratic, where it's like the translators are sitting in a room looking at the text like, okay, can we come up with a word that no one has ever used before to translate this word, right? Because we don't want to be accused of copying, so they come up with all these like brand new things. And then it just doesn't sound like the Bible after a while. It just sounds like, I don't know, something else.
Like the Message or something.
Yeah, so the ESV is really nice because it really feels like and sounds like the Bible that we're used to from translations like the King James, the Douay-Rheims, the RSV. And yet it's updated, it's new, it's based on the latest scholarship and so forth. So there are some real virtues to the ESV that take it to a level that's just, I just think it's great. So I've enjoyed using it, And then when I heard that there was a Catholic edition coming out, I was just really surprised. I just had no idea that was ever going to happen. And when I found out about it, it was already like basically being published, And so that was just really encouraging, and I met some of the people involved in the project, and like one thing led to another, and all of a sudden the Augustine Institute where I work is publishing the ESV Catholic edition in the United States. And so it might be worth giving a little bit of the background
to
like where the ESV came from to like
Yes.
sense of why we arrived at this particular moment.
And and just to set the stage a little bit, so the 2005 ESV that you got was probably Protestant Bible that was missing
Yeah.
the 7 books of the Old
Right.
Testament, including the Book of Wisdom, your love.
Yeah.
And I actually did grow up on the ESV when it did come out. And so when I became Catholic about 6 years ago, I was pretty disappointed with the Bible translations like the NAB and even the Revised Standard Version. I currently use the Revised Standard Version Second Catholic Edition, but I'm super excited to get my hands on the ESV Catholic Edition that's now out because that was what I was used to, and it flows more eloquently and just like it. I don't know, it's just way better to my ears at least. Yeah. And just to also set the stage here, there's about 450 different English translations, but most of those are not Catholic, and so there's very few Catholic approved editions, and so it's a big deal to have the ESV as a Catholic edition, as like this is officially now approved by the Vatican.
So a little bit of background is probably in order, right?
Yes.
These English-speaking Catholics use the Douay-Rheims translation. And the Douay-Rheims has its own like unique and venerable history in that it was translated during a time of persecution by Catholic scholars who were living in exile from England in France. They translated the New Testament first, which was called the Rheims Testament, and then they translated the Old Testament, which was called the Douay, right?
Did it translate
in those cities?
Did it translate from the original Greek and Hebrew, or was it translation from the Vulgate in Latin?
From the Vulgate, from the Latin. So the Douay-Rheims is kind of funny because sometimes you'll be reading it and think, that just doesn't sound like what I'm used to with the Bible. And the reason is that you're getting like another layer in the filter there, right? Because it's going from Greek or Hebrew into Latin and then from Latin into English. But what the Douay-Rheims is really helpful for is if you're learning Latin, right? I know this from experience, right? You're learning Latin, you're trying to translate some of the scripture from the Vulgate into English just to work on your Latin. You can check your work with the Douay-Rheims. So it's really great in that sense. But the Douay-Rheims is kind of weird because it's not like a monolith. It's so easy for us to think of these Bible translations as like, well, there's this one, and then there's this one, and then there's that one. But in fact, they're more like families, right? So the original Douay-Rheims is almost impossible to find. It came out originally in 1609, but it was revised pretty heavily by a bishop named Challoner. I think around, I want to say 1850s, right? Mid-1800s. And so almost all of the Douay-Rheims Bibles you can find now are the Challoner revision. And what's funny about the Challoner revision is that he's actually revising the Douay-Rheims in the direction of the King James Bible. So like if you really want like the Douay-Rheims that's not quasi King James, you have to go back to before the Challoner revision. And then there are additional revisions on top of that. So like most of the ones that you might pick up at a used Catholic bookstore might say on them Confraternity edition, which is a reference to, I don't know if you remember, you probably don't remember because you didn't grow up Catholic, CCD, right? Confraternity of Christian
I've heard
Doctrine.
of that.
Yeah, so it was like, I had to go to CCD class when I was a kid. And everybody did, right? That was like where you got catechized. And that's a reference to this sort of body that the U.S. bishops set up called the Confraternity of Christian Doctrine, which I don't even think it exists anymore. But anyway, so there were a handful of minor revisions of the Challoner revision of the Douay-Rheims, early 20th century. And one of my favorite anecdotes about this has to do with the foundation of the Catholic Biblical Association. So I'm part of a group of Catholic biblical scholars called the Catholic Biblical Association of America, the CBA. And there are only a few hundred of us, but the CBA was founded in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And its original purpose was to produce a new Bible translation for the American church. And what's funny about it is they actually started working on it, and they started working on a translation from the Vulgate into English until Pope Pius XII released an encyclical, Divino Afflante Spiritu, in 1943, where he said that Catholic Bible translations ought to be made from the original languages. So after that was released, the Catholic Biblical Association essentially scrapped their translation and started over, working directly from Hebrew and Greek. And that project that began then in 1943 eventually got published as the New American Bible in 1970. And of course, that's the Bible that we use at Mass.
Wow. So
Yeah.
it took like 30 years.
Well, yeah, I mean, it took a while for it to get, obviously the New Testament's a lot shorter, Old Testament's a lot longer. And so, it takes a while for those projects to come together, and then it has to go through all these different committees and things. I would say it's relatively long for a Bible translation, but the New American Bible, New Testament, was revised in the 1980s. So they released a revised New Testament in 1984. And then the Old Testament, they started revising almost right after that. And a lot of the work on the Old Testament revision was done in the early 1990s, but it didn't actually come out until 2011. So now you can buy the New American Bible Revised Edition, which has the revised 1984 New Testament, the revised 2011 Old Testament, right, in one volume. That's what we use at Mass now, the NABRE. And actually, right now, they're working on yet another revision of the NAB Bible.
Wow. So, okay, this may sound like a terrible question, but why, when I started reading the NAB, did it rub me the wrong way? As far as like using a lot of sentences that really just seemed like so foreign to like the Bible translation that I had grown up with, the ESV, which apparently, and we'll get into this, is more accurate to the original text.
Yeah.
So why is it such a, to me at least, it seems like a strange translation. So why is that?
Yeah, I mean, it really gets into different styles of Bible translation. There are lots and lots of different styles and lots of theories about how to do it the right way, and there are very smart people that hold differing opinions about this. So I treat a lot of this stuff in detail in my book on Bible translation and the ESV, but one important feature of mid-20th century intellectual life was a new approach to translation in general. So not just Bible translation, but all translation. And it was based on certain theories in linguistics about how an idea that's expressed with certain words in one language might need to be expressed with a different set of words in another language. And so the big proponent of this in the world of Bible translation was this man named Eugene Nida. And Eugene Nida eventually became sort of like head of the United Bible Societies, which is like this international conglomeration of Bible translators. And his theory became popularly known as dynamic equivalence, where you take the meaning of a phrase in one language and then you translate it with a different phrase in another language. And so this theory became very, very important in the Bible translation movement. So it's important to understand that we're not just talking about English here, right? We're talking about hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of languages. And you actually have a whole ministry of people, especially in the Protestant world, who devote their entire lives to translating the Bible into obscure languages. So the largest group of these translators is called the Wycliffe Bible Translators. And they've done an incredible job of getting the Bible into almost every human language that's on earth. It's really tremendous what they've done. But one of the ways in which they've been able to work so quickly, right, is that their theory of Bible translation goes phrase by phrase by phrase, rather than word by word by word.
Okay.
And this is where, again, the disagreement arises over English Bible translations, right? It's possible to make a Bible translation that way into English. And in fact, the Eugene Nida UBS team did. You might have heard of the Good News Bible.
Nope.
You don't know the Good News Bible? Okay,
No.
Otherwise known as I think it's called the Contemporary English Version.
Okay.
So the Good News Bible was an attempt to apply that method to Bible translation into English. And so and in fact, I remember when I was a grade school kid, I got a Good News Bible because that was the one that my school required. And so we read the Good News Bible together. And the Good News Bible is interesting because in some ways it feels very biblical, right? But in some
That's good.
loose, it's not like the Message, it's like a really different feel. It's like, it really feels like the Bible, and yet, it's like one step removed from something as precise as RSV or ESV or this sort of thing. Now, of course, you can get further away from precision with paraphrase style translations like the New Living Translation or New Living Bible from the early 1970s. They've updated it with a slightly different theory. Now it's called the New Living Translation, but the old one, the New Living Bible, is very paraphrase oriented. My favorite quote from it is when the Good Samaritan drops the guy off at the inn, and he gives the innkeeper a 20.
Oh wow!
Right? You're like, what? Okay. And then of course the Message is like yet another theory for how this goes. Right? That was Eugene Peterson, if I remember. Apparently,
Does that even count as a Bible translation though, or is that just
the Message?
Yeah.
It's a paraphrase, right?
Yeah.
It's a paraphrase translation. So all Bible translations are a form of interpretation, but a paraphrase translation is like an extra step. Like you're really, really trying to explain it. And this is where the sort of debate always comes back to, right? Is like, what is the job of the translator? What is he supposed to be doing, right? Is the translator supposed to be explaining the text, right? That would be like the Message. Or is the translator supposed to simply be like almost like a function, right? Like almost like a computer algorithm, just sort of delivering the meaning from one language into another. And that's really the debate, right? Should we be going, phrase by phrase, or should we be going word by word? And there are good arguments on both sides. And like I said, there are really intelligent Bible scholars on both sides of that debate. And there are a lot of like medial positions, and so I kind of feel like the best stance, for a teacher like me to take is, well, I think it's really good if you don't know Greek or Hebrew. Okay, gold star if you know Greek and Hebrew. Great, do that, okay? But if you don't know Greek and Hebrew, then use multiple translations. And the sort of greatest compromise in this direction is this thing called the Amplified Bible. Have you ever seen that?
I've heard of it. I don't know if I've actually seen it.
So the Amplified Bible is kind of funny, right? Because it's almost like the Relativist Bible or the Thesaurus Bible, because every time there's a key term, instead of translating it with one word, they translate it with like this word or this word or this word or this word, right? So it's like you have all this extra meaning available to you in translation that I don't really know how useful that is, right? It's like, I mean, maybe, again, why not just learn, Greek and Hebrew, right? It would just be easier than having to read a Bible like that. So, okay, so you have this continuum, right? And you've got like the paraphrase translations are at one end, like the Message and the New Living, or the New Living Bible, and then you have like translations that sort of inhabit the middle, like maybe like the NIV. I think I would put the New American Bible in that category. A few other ones, and then you have translations on the totally opposite end of the spectrum that are really trying to pursue a word-for-word translation style. And the most extreme in that direction is this translation called the New American Standard Bible, the NASB.
Okay.
And the New American Standard Bible, it's like they really, really, really try to do word for word. So much so that it's like they want to have like one word in Hebrew translates to one word in English. And if there are any words in English that they have to add for the sake of clarity, they italicize them. Right? So if those words aren't in the original language, then they're italicized, so that word's actually not in Greek and not in Hebrew. So something really great about the NASB, and again, like if you're learning Greek or Hebrew and you're translating, you can use the NASB to check your work. But the problem with the NASB is like, it's really hard to read out loud, right?
Yeah.
It's like really wooden and stiff. There are some churches that do it, but I think most churches that have tried it, again, it's a Protestant translation, most Protestant churches that have tried using the NASB, it's just like the experiment doesn't work out because it's just kind of clunky, right? Or wooden, as my Greek teacher would say. Okay, so this is where a translation like the RSV, the NRSV, or the ESV can really be helpful, right? Is that these translations are really seeking to pursue a kind of word-for-word approach. So we got to talk about that family of translations for a second, for this to all make sense, right? So the granddaddy of them all is the King James Version, okay? The King James Version is left untouched from about 1611. For the most part, it's true there are printing errors and things, okay? But for the most part, it's untouched until the late 1800s, when there's a group of scholars in England that decide it's time to revise the King James Version. And what's funny about the revisions that they did is some of the revisions are actually like more antiquated than the King James for whatever reason.
Wow.
So right, that particular thing is often called the RV, the Revised Version, or even the ERV, English Revised Version. The English scholars recruited a group of American scholars to help them. And the American scholars, they had their own meetings and sent over their suggested revisions to England. But by the time their revisions got there, the English scholars weren't interested in really incorporating them. So they just kind of like put them in as an appendix. Okay. So the Americans, in a kind of act of, academic retaliation, published their own Bible, their own revision called the American Standard Version. And you know what they did? They took the revisions of the English committee and threw those in the back as an appendix.
Wow.
So
Bible Wars.
So you ended up with like parallel revisions of the King James at the same time. You've got the RV, or the English Revised Version, and then you've got the American Standard Version. These are like basically simultaneous. I think that the ERV technically came out in the 1880s and the ASV was right around 1900. Okay. So the ASV then becomes the standard version that is used in seminaries, Protestant seminaries in the United States. And there's a kind of move among the, if you will, the more liberal Protestant groups, right? So mainline Protestants in the United States to revise the ASV, to revise the standard version. So that project where they get a group of scholars together right around World War II ends up being called the Revised Standard Version.
Okay.
So the Revised Standard Version is a revision of the ASV.
Wow.
Okay, we're getting deep in the weeds now.
No, this is great. This is so good.
So the original New Testament of the RSV comes out in 1946. And they did it to great fanfare, right? So you got all these mainline churches that are quite strong at that time. And this is like, wow, we finally get a new Bible. They give a copy to President Truman on the day that it's published. They have Bible rallies around the country. They literally sell 1 million copies on the first day that this Bible is released.
Wow.
And it's just the New Testament at that point. In fact, I think even the Chicago Tribune published the entirety of the New Testament of the RSV in the newspaper.
Wow.
Right. It's kind of unbelievable. Little tiny print, but still, it's like it was like a really big marketing success. Okay, so I think it's in 1952 is when they released the Old Testament. So now you have a complete RSV, and then it's in 1957 that they released the Apocrypha. Okay, why do they need to do that? Because some Protestants still use those books, like Lutherans use them sometimes, and Anglicans even more frequently, right? So they have to have
which some would call deuterocanonical or just canonical, really. But
right. And so then what happens? I mean, this gets really confusing, okay? Because the RSV essentially was an American project, right? And if you remember back to what I said about the Catholic Biblical Association, at the same time that that's going on, the American Catholic Biblical Scholars are having their own meetings, right, coming up with their own translation. So they're not really interested in the RSV, right? They're not even really that happy about it, right? And they certainly would not want a Catholic edition of it, not in the United States.
Okay.
So there's a group of English scholars, English Catholic scholars, who are part of the Catholic Biblical Association of England, who get really interested in the idea of having a Catholic edition of the RSV, right? Because then Protestants and Catholics could use the same Bible, right? A idea that they refer to as the common Bible, right? Having a common Bible for Protestants and Catholics. Well, the bishops in the late 50s and early 60s are not too interested in going on board with that. However, right, there's like a change in the bishops right around like the mid 1960s. And the English Catholic scholars sort of get an idea like this is the moment, right? This is the moment that we've been waiting for to try to get a common Bible for Catholics and Protestants. And so they get a certain bishop. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I think he's a cardinal to approve a Catholic edition of the RSV. This is in 1965 and 1966 when the Catholic edition of the RSV is released. And in the Catholic edition of the RSV, if you get a copy of like the original one that they printed, in the back, it has a list of all of the changes that were made from the regular RSV, the Protestant RSV, to the Catholic RSV. There aren't very many. It's like a few dozen changes, right? It's not a lot. Okay, and then the Old Testament, my understanding is they didn't make any changes.
Wow.
Right.
Except for I guess they already had the 7 books.
Right. So you have the Deuterocanon in there, but there
Yeah.
aren't any actual changes in the Old Testament.
Wow.
Okay, so then you have the RSV Catholic edition. This is like 1966, and the RSV Catholic edition gets adopted for the lectionary in England and Ireland and Australia and India and various other places. Now, right around the same time, there's another project, the Jerusalem Bible. I actually have a copy of it sitting here on my desk. This big old Bible. You ever seen one of these?
Yes. It's what the Orthodox use, right?
No.
Oh, it's
So
not.
the Jerusalem Bible was an interesting project because it was originally a French translation.
Okay.
And the idea is that they would do a more kind of dynamic equivalence approach. The layout is very different. So it's in single column instead of double column. Instead of translating the Tetragrammaton as the Lord, which had been traditional in English translation, they translate the holy name of God as Yahweh. And so the Jerusalem Bible has its kind of own approach, and it attempts to be literary and beautiful, and yet it's not wedded to a kind of word for word style. Now, the problem with the Jerusalem Bible is, even though they claim in the preface that the whole thing was translated from the original languages, from Greek and Hebrew, Dom Henry Wansborough, who's like the number one person who was personally responsible for the New Jerusalem Bible and now the revised New Jerusalem Bible, has said publicly, yeah, they didn't really translate it from the original languages. Most of it was translated from the French.
Wow.
And he would know that, right? He's a Bible scholar. He's a monk, wonderful person, right? And he has personally gone through every single word and revised the translation, right? So the New Jerusalem Bible came out in the 1980s. And then he did a second pass, and the revised New Jerusalem Bible came out, I think, a year or two ago. So he knows what he's talking about when he says that. And so the Jerusalem Bible is kind of weird. So the Jerusalem Bible got approved for the lectionary in many of those same countries. So in a lot of those countries, right, again, Ireland, England, Scotland, India, Australia, South America, or South Africa, you've got the RSV Catholic edition and the Jerusalem Bible both being used for liturgy.
Wow. That's wild. That's confusing.
It's really confusing. Yeah, super confusing. So you got any questions on that up to 1966 before I go on to the NRSV and beyond?
Well, this may be a step backwards,
Okay,
but
sure.
The original text, like the original manuscripts that we have, I've heard it argued, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the Vulgate, so the original Latin translation that Jerome set forth to do from the original languages, is using manuscripts before the Masoretic text that comes later. And so if we translate from the Latin, it might actually be a closer translation to the original text than using the Masoretic text, even though these other ones are using Greek and Hebrew, but it's a later version that I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, but basically,
well, this is all really complicated, right?
Yeah.
The important thing to remember, right, is that there are multiple manuscript traditions, and that each one has its own kind of validity and importance. And we can't, as text critics, dismiss any ancient textual tradition, right? We have to be very careful in our judgment about the ancient textual traditions that have come down to us. So while you're right that Saint Jerome is translating from manuscripts that are very ancient, because he's living in ancient times, it's also true that we actually have copies of the Greek manuscripts that are older than Saint Jerome, right?
Yeah.
The most important Greek manuscripts, right, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, predate Saint Jerome. And these are, Greek manuscripts of the whole Bible, Old Testament and New.
Wow.
Right. So, so maybe the Greek tradition is more important, right? And the thing to say is that it's complicated, right? And it requires detailed study and considered judgment to really arrive at what we should be thinking about these ancient texts, right? You also have a totally separate linguistic tradition, right? The Syriac tradition or Aramaic tradition of the Bible in the Peshitta, which has very important readings, some of which are probably original. So the Hebrew manuscripts that we have access to, the most ancient complete ones, are the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex, but they're both about 900 AD, so relatively late, right? If our Greek manuscripts are about 300, 350 AD, you're thinking, well, it seems like the Greek is more ancient than the Hebrew, but the Hebrew is the original language for most of those. So, and then the really wonderful thing is, the Jewish scholars that preserved those Hebrew manuscripts worked very, very hard to preserve their accuracy over time. So if you look in the margins of like the Leningrad Codex or these other codices, you'll notice these little notations. And those little notations are the scribes actually counting the number of words in the book, like in say, the book of Ruth or the book of Psalms, counting the number of words. They count the number of letters. And then they label which word in the book is the central word and which letter in the book is the central letter. And then at the end of the manuscript, right, they have a little tally where they tell you how many letters there are, how many words there are, and so forth. So they were very dedicated to preserving the manuscripts that came down to them as accurately as possible. You could think of it almost like, how we have like quality control managers and factories, or we have ways of checking the accuracy of documents before they get published.
Yeah.
That's what they were doing. So if you compare, say the Leningrad Codex of Isaiah to the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is 2,000 years old and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's the largest scroll we have, they match.
Wow.
So they did a really good job, right? They preserved the text for 900 years. Now, of course, if you dive deep into the details, you will realize that there are some changes in spelling. So some of the spelling conventions over time change, right? There are a handful of textual differences, but I mean, it's the same. It's the same Isaiah, right?
That's amazing.
It's really amazing. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were just like a really wonderful revelation for all of us, because they showed that the Hebrew tradition that we had was authentic. It was accurate.
Okay.
Now, is it exactly the same down to every detail? No. That's why we need scholars, right? And is the Hebrew tradition always better than the Latin or the Greek tradition? No. Which is why if you pick up your Hebrew Bible, it has lots of Greek and Latin footnotes, right? Where it'll say, well, the Greek says this in this particular case, and the Latin says this,
Mm-hmm.
So the text of Scripture then, is something that constantly needs to be studied and talked about and read and reread and worked on. But it's important, I think, for us not to form like stereotype judgments like, oh, the Latin is the best, or oh, the Greek is the best, or oh, the Hebrew is the best. It's like, well, it's actually pretty complicated. I mean, my favorite example is the book of Sirach. So the book of Sirach was originally written in Hebrew, but it was only preserved in Greek. We only had it in Greek up until about 1892, when the Cairo Geniza was discovered. So a Geniza is like a tomb. And in ancient times, if a holy manuscript wore out at a synagogue, you would either burn it or you would bury it in a Geniza. And in Egypt, if you did that with a manuscript, it would just stay there because it's so dry. It's like Colorado. It's just so dry.
Wow.
So these scholars, archaeologists, found this Geniza that had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ancient manuscripts. And among those ancient manuscripts, they discovered Hebrew Syriac for the first time. We had never, ever, ever seen it, right? So they find, I think it's 5 manuscripts of Hebrew Syriac. I think 4 of them were found there, and 1 was found at Masada. Maybe I'm getting the details a little bit off here.
Wow.
They found Hebrew Syriac. So we have the book of Syriac in Hebrew, about 2/3 of it now. But the problem is, right, it's in like 4 or 5 different Hebrew manuscripts, and they don't all overlap, right? And then like when they do overlap, they don't always agree. So now, like, to read the book of Syriac honestly, it's really complicated, right? Because you have to sit down with the Greek, then you have to sit down on all the different versions, fragmentary versions of the Hebrew, and then you have to kind of like make a decision as to what the right text is. So if you look at any modern Bible in the book of Sirach, there are lots and lots of footnotes, even in the ESV Catholic edition or any other Bible, right? There are lots of footnotes that say, well, in this case, Hebrew manuscript A says this, but Hebrew manuscript B says that, and the Greek says this. So it gets really complicated in certain cases.
Wow.
Sorry, we're going too deep into the weeds here. But.
No, this is great. I'm enjoying this, at least. I hope the listeners are too. And then one other question before you jump back into the story of the ESV is the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which the earliest Christians used, right?
Yeah.
Where does that play into all of this when we're looking at Bible translations and like, and how that fits in the story?
Is a really important thing, but again, it's important to think of the Septuagint more like a manuscript family rather than a monolith, right? It's not as though like there was some scholar who translated the Old Testament into Greek and was like, here, boom, now I have the Septuagint. It's, there are a lot of Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament, and we could refer to that group of manuscripts as the Septuagint. And we think that the Septuagint translation began right around 200 BC, when Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who created the Great Library of Alexandria, wanted a copy of the Jewish scriptures in his library. So that's when it begins, right? They probably translated the Torah first, right? And then they translated these other books, right? The prophets and so forth. So eventually you have a complete, Greek translation of the Old Testament. As to when that translation was complete, it's a little bit hard to say, right? It could have been before the time of Jesus. It could have been during the first century. But for certain, it was done by the time of these great manuscripts that I referred to, right around 300, right? So Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus. So those great manuscripts include all of the Bible, Old Testament and New. And they also include some of those other books that are kind of in the Septuagint but aren't part of the canon, like Psalm 151 and 3rd Maccabees and 4th Maccabees and this sort of thing.
Wow. Yeah, so are there any English translations that are strictly from the Septuagint and then others? Okay.
Yeah, there are. So there's some older ones you can find for free online. There was one done by a scholar named Brenton, who I think it was maybe in the 1800s. You can find that for free. But there's a relatively new one called the New English Translation of the Septuagint, aka the Nets. Nets, which is to be distinguished from the Net Bible. It's not the Net Bible, it's the Nets with an S Bible.
Wow.
And you can actually find that, if I'm not mistaken, on their website. They have what do you call them? Secure PDFs that you can view but not print of the Nets Bible. I've used that a lot. I've referred to it a lot while I've been working on the Book of Wisdom. The Nets is a great resource. So if you want to, so like the Septuagint is kind of weird because at certain points the order of the books differs, or like not the order of the books, the order of the chapters differs from the Hebrew Bible. Most dramatically in Jeremiah and Proverbs. So if you take a look at the Nets, look at those books in particular.
Wow. All right. Well, jumping back to the story of the ESV Catholic edition. So we were in 1966 or so when the RSV Catholic edition got approved, and even for liturgical use. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, the Catechism of the Catholic Church that came out in 1992, most of the Bible quotes are from the RSV Catholic edition, right? Yep. And so it's definitely been approved by the Catholic Church. And so what happened next?
Yeah, so this is where the story gets pretty complicated because you start getting forks in the story. But after the publication of the RSV Catholic edition, the board of translators for the RSV gets back together and they say, it's been about 20-ish, 25-ish years. Let's revise the New Testament. So they produced a revised RSV New Testament that came out in 1972. It was only a Protestant edition, right? They never produced a Catholic edition of that. After the 1972 publication of it, they said, okay, let's go back and revise the Old Testament. And that project never materialized. So when they started revising the Old Testament of the RSV, they eventually decided, let's just scrap the RSV and produce a completely new RSV, aka the NRSV.
Okay.
So in the 80s and 90s, in the 70s and 80s, the Board of Translators produced a completely new version, which we now know as the NRSV. It came out in 1990.
And what were they translating from? The original text or from like the English version of the ASV back in the day?
Oh, yeah. No. So in all of these translations that I'm referring to in this family of translations, they're translating directly from Greek and Hebrew.
Okay.
Right. And so the people involved are all, Bible scholars and professors of Greek and Hebrew. And this sort of.
So this is a totally new English version of the Bible based on the ancient manuscripts.
No, it's not totally new, right? It's an update, right? So,
okay.
Right, because the ASV is an update of the King James, and the RSV is an update of the ASV, and the NRSV is an update of the RSV.
Wow.
And even the NASB, that really wooden one that I referred to earlier,
yes.
That's actually a fork from the ASV.
Wow.
Yeah, so in some ways, all of these are related, okay? So the NRSV, seeks to update the RSV. But the NRSV ends up being really controversial, both in Catholic circles and in Protestant ones. So the hope was that the NRSV would replace the RSV, and it would be the one Bible translations that both Catholics and Protestants use. That was the hope. And they even had a Catholic priest on the translation team for the NRSV. Unfortunately, they decided to push a certain translation agenda that was not palatable to everybody in the American Church, Catholic and Protestant. Okay, what was that agenda? It essentially had to do with what we call inclusive language. Okay? So in the NRSV, you come across, let's say in the RSV, you come across the word man, and the NRSV, that's now going to be person, right? Or you come across the word brothers in the RSV, and the NRSV, now it's brothers and sisters. And so what the NRSV is trying to do is sort of expand the meaning of these passages to sort of make them feel more inclusive or welcoming, right? And this is, again, like a really hot button issue in Bible translation. So now we're not really talking about dynamic equivalence versus word for word. We're talking about gender. And maybe the most egregious example of this in the NRSV, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man, the Son of Man, the Son of Man.
Yeah.
Well, it's a reference back to this passage in Daniel chapter 7, where there's this figure like a son of man coming on the clouds, comes to the Ancient of Days. You probably know the passage, right?
Yes.
Well, if you look at that in the NRSV, it says one like a human being.
Oh, gosh.
Right? So what does that mean? It means that, like, you can't connect the pieces between what Jesus is saying and the Old Testament text that he's referring to.
Wow.
Right? One of my favorite ones in the NRSV is how Jesus tells the disciples, I will make you fishers of people. Right?
Wow.
You're like, I don't know about that. It's not wrong, right? It's not wrong. It just sounds bad. It just sounds weird, right?
Right.
So this is part of the problem with inclusive language, right? Is like, gosh, what are we supposed to do about this? Because, on the one hand, you have this kind of pastoral priority, right? You don't want anyone to feel excluded from the text. If the text is meant to apply to all Christians, male and female, then maybe it should be translated that way, right? But on the other end, it's like, well, what about accuracy? Like, isn't accuracy really important? Like, don't we want to be able to read it as clearly as possible, get as close as we can to the meaning of the original language? And so it becomes a kind of tug of war of these priorities. Okay, so the NRSV comes out, and a lot of Catholics and a lot of Protestants are not happy with its inclusive language decisions. And that produces a kind of crisis in the 1990s, where both Catholics and Protestants are kind of hunting for new Bible translations. In the Catholic world, it actually gets kind of political. Not that other things don't, okay? But the U.S. bishops approve the NRSV.
Oh, wow.
They're planning to make a lectionary based on the NRSV. But then their approval, goes up to the Vatican, and the Vatican says, no way.
Good.
Not approved. No way. We're not doing that. And in the meantime, right, between the time the U.S. bishops approved it and the Vatican said no, the Canadians not only approved the NRSV, but published an NRSV-based lectionary.
Oh.
Right? So you had this really awkward situation where the Vatican says, you Americans can't use the NRSV in the lectionary. And then the U.S. bishops are like, well, what about the Canadians? They're already using it, right? And so it produces a really awkward situation. So what the Vatican decides to do is allow the Canadians to keep using the NRSV lectionary since they've already implemented it, as long as they promise to revise it, okay, in accord with Vatican translation norms. So and the Canadians eventually do revise it, I think around 2010. So now they're using a Canadian lectionary specific version of the NRSV in Canada, okay? And in the United States, the Vatican is like, well, we're not going to approve the NRSV, but we will allow you to use the NRSV for private study. Okay, so the NRSV it just ends up in a really weird spot, right? Where in some sense it gets adopted by the scholarly community that produced it as a really good neutral translation. Okay, so the SBL study Bible or whatever is based on the NRSV, and the HarperCollins study Bible is based on the NRSV. So there's kind of the NRSV is regarded as kind of a neutral and accurate translation that's politically correct, okay? But there were a lot of congregations that weren't happy with it, both Protestant and Catholic. So it never gets implemented into the Catholic liturgy, right? In the Catholic liturgy, we're still using the New American Bible. Okay, so all of this then leads to yet another controversy about inclusive language, which sparks from the Protestant side. We haven't mentioned the NIV yet. The
right.
International version. So the NIV project was conceived of in the 1960s as a conservative response to the supposed liberalism of the RSV.
Oh, okay.
Isn't that interesting? Okay. So relatively conservative evangelical scholars produced the NIV, which I think originally comes out in 1970. Okay. In the 1990s, there's talk of revising the NIV and whatever. And one of the things that they do in the 1990s is release an inclusive language edition of the NIV called the NIVI. They first publish it in England, and then they're about to publish it in the United States when some conservative elements in the evangelical world catch wind of it and are like, we do not want an inclusive language edition of the NIV to be allowed right in American evangelicalism. And so this leads to a kind of showdown, if you will, between the publisher, Zondervan, and these more conservative people. And the showdown happens at Focus on the Family headquarters in Colorado Springs. It's hosted by none other than James Dobson himself. So he hosts the two sides, and they have this kind of debate about inclusive language. And at the end of the day, literally, they compose a memo that's referred to as the Colorado Springs Guidelines for Inclusive Language, where they reach a kind of compromise about how inclusive language should and should not be used in Bible translation. And the NIVI is pulled. They don't publish it. And both sides sign this agreement, and the Colorado Springs Guidelines are published in the evangelical magazine Christianity Today. And it seems like everything's fine then. But it's really clearly not quite fine, okay?
Yeah.
So the conservative elements at that meeting end up producing a Bible translation that's based on the Colorado Springs Guidelines in regards to inclusive language. That's called the ESV. right? The English Standard Version. And what's hilarious, I think, from a Catholic perspective, is that the Colorado Springs guidelines and the Vatican's translation guidelines on inclusive language overlap. They're almost identical, right? They're very, very similar principles. So there's a way in which, like, it makes perfect sense, okay, that the priority being on accuracy, the priority being on, considered decision-making in principle about inclusive language is what's going to be acceptable to both Protestants and Catholics that care deeply about Bible translation accuracy. Now,
so the ESV, so the ESV was a translation, like pulling from the original sources, but it was based on the RSV at all?
Update of the RSV.
It's the update of the RSV. Okay. And so, but then we have the RSV Second Catholic Edition that comes out after the ESV.
I know, right? It gets really confusing, okay? So what had happened was the publication of the RSV had lapsed, right? The National Council of Churches that was responsible for it decided they wanted the NRSV to replace it, and we'll just let the RSV fall by the wayside. Well, a lot of conservative Catholics and Protestants weren't happy about that, and they still wanted their RSV Bibles available. So in the case of the ESV, Crossway purchased rights from the National Council of Churches for the RSV so that they could produce a revision of it. And a very similar thing happened with Ignatius Press. So Ignatius Press produced a revision of the Catholic edition of the RSV that we now know as the RSV 2CE or RSV Second Catholic Edition. I think it came out right around 2005, if I'm not mistaken, 2004, 2005. And so if you think of it like the RSV 2CE and the ESV are like on parallel tracks, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is in the Protestant world, one's in the Catholic world. They're basically trying to do something very, very similar. The RSV 2CE is a minor revision, right? They're changing less than 1% of the words, right? And it's like very minor. And then the ESV is a more major revision where they're changing about 8% of the words. So you're in the territory of about 60,000 plus words that are being changed in the ESV. There's a kind of afterlife to the NIVI, which comes out a little bit later, called the TNIV, today's new international version. And then there's a revision of the NIV that comes out in 2011. So just to kind of finish that fork of the story, right? But to get back to the ESV, the ESV is originally published in 2001 by Crossway Books as a Protestant translation. Initially they didn't have a lot of money, didn't have a lot of traction and whatever else, right? So one of the things that they did that I think was really admirable is they released digital editions of the ESV for free. So to promote the translation. So if you bought an ESV early on, they would send you a CD-ROM that had the translation on it.
Wow.
Same thing if you went online to a lot of these Bible software programs, you could download a copy of the ESV for free. So that was one way that they could promote the translation and get people familiar with it and using it. And now the ESV is used in a lot of churches and seminaries and so forth. It was in, I think, 2016 that the publisher in India, the Asian Trading Corporation, reached out to Crossway and said, hey, we'd really like to do a Catholic edition of the ESV that could be used for the liturgy here in India. Okay, why would they be interested in that? Well, in India, they'd been using the Jerusalem Bible and the RSV since the 1960s, right? They realized they needed an updated translation. And there really is not a whole lot available for them. The Indian bishops had already approved the New Living Translation, Catholic edition, which had been a Protestant translation and was made a Catholic edition in India. But that was only for private study because the New Living Translation was a kind of paraphrase style translation. It wasn't considered in accord with the Vatican's translation guidelines. So I keep referring to these guidelines. They're in a document, I think it was released in 2001, called Liturgiam Authenticam.
Okay.
And this document offers very specific guidelines for how the liturgy is to be translated. And this, of course, also applies to scripture that's used in the liturgy. And some of the things that the NRSV had done, whether it be with inclusive language or in other other ways is essentially kind of put on the shelf, right? It's like, well, we're not going to do that anymore. It's like one of the things that the NRSV had done for inclusive language is systematically substitute pronouns to make certain biblical passages sound more inclusive, right? So instead of it being he, him, whatever, right, they would make it, they would obscure the pronouns. So like one example of this, and I'm not remembering off the top of my head if this is in the NRSV, is in Psalm 1. So I'm gonna look it up here while we're
the just person instead of the just man.
Yeah. So in the King James, right, it's blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. Okay. Whereas in the NRSV, it is happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked. You're thinking, well, no big deal, right? It's just an inclusive way of rendering that nice biblical lesson that we all ought to reject the advice of the wicked. But in fact, St. Augustine reads Psalm 1 as a Christological psalm, right? Jesus is the one who walks not in the counsel of the wicked nor stands in the way of sinners. So if you translate Psalm 1:1 inclusively, like the NRSV does, all of a sudden you take away the possibility of the Christological reading.
Wow.
Okay?
And that's what's at stake.
That's exactly what's at stake. So, and the Vatican translation guidelines point to that in specific, right? The Christological reading of the Psalms is one of the things that they're concerned about. So, again, it's a really difficult topic to have like a fully balanced opinion about, because there are really good arguments on all sides of these issues, but there's I think a real legitimacy and value to the approach that the ESV takes to inclusive language. And if you look at the preface to the ESV, there's actually a long paragraph devoted to this subject where they explain in great detail what their philosophy for inclusive language is, right? And it's essentially like when you have a situation where God is being compared to man or mankind, they're going to use the word man. Okay, why are they going to do that? To indicate human nature. So, I mean, like a great example of this might be like, man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. They're going to preserve that as gender exclusive, right, or gender specific, using the word man in that case to show that kind of dichotomy between man and God. But in other cases, the ESV is going to be more inclusive than the RSV. Okay, because they're dedicated to those Colorado Springs guidelines and the compromise that they drew up with their friends, right? That they're going to be very clear that in certain cases they're going to use the word person, or they're going to use they when there's no male meaning in the original language. So what I like about the ESV and its approach to inclusive language is that it's totally transparent what they're doing. They're telling you up front, here's how we're making these decisions, okay? Here's how we're going to render these original language concepts into English. That's how we're doing it. And a lot of the other translations just aren't going to give you that level of detail or specificity, or they're just not even going to be that consistent, right? In some cases, it's Son of Man. In other cases, it's human being. But the ESV is going to be very consistent in the way that it goes about translating gendered terms.
Now, what if they accidentally, I don't know if this would happen because they're all geniuses, but they translate something as person because they think, oh yeah, this has no relevance, like, but then later come to find out, oh, actually there was a Christological connection there that we totally bypassed because we did that.
Yeah. Well, actually it's funny because, because their policy is so detailed and it's so publicly stated, there was early on, I think this was in 2002, a scholar who wasn't part of the ESV translation team caught them making an exception or a mistake to their stated principle and publicly wrote about it in like an evangelical theological journal. And to their credit, they went back and they modified that verse. I think it was in the book of Acts, right? They modified that verse to adhere to the policy. So there have been very minor updates to the ESV text. I think on 3 occasions, they've released lists of minor changes that they were making. And they've tried to do this very infrequently and to to make the translation more in accord with their stated translation principles. So one example of this in the New Testament, the word doulos is normally translated as slave. And in like the RSV, the King James, in most Bible translations, it's translated as slave. In some Bible translations, it's rendered as servant.
Okay.
Okay, so originally that word doulos was rendered as slave in the New Testament in the ESV. But I think it was I want to say it was 2011, I don't remember the exact year, they had an internal debate and discussion about this word, and they changed the translation of it to bondservant, because they felt like that word in English, even though it's a rare word in English, did a better job of capturing the type of slavery that was common in the Greco-Roman world during the first century.
Wow.
Now, you might not agree, or you might have a different opinion about how doulos ought to be translated in the New Testament, but the fact that they were willing to revisit that word and have a detailed conversation about it and actually make that big of a change, to me, I feel like it honors, like, seeing that, like, just like, it's like, wow, it just reveals their honor and respect for the biblical text,
Yeah.
for the process of Bible translation.
Wow. So the Indian bishops of the Catholic Church, they submit for approval of this ESV Catholic edition that they can use in their liturgical services. So not just for private reading, but for liturgy, the lectionary. And they get approved.
Right.
In 2019?
So the initial approval actually was in, I think, May of 2017.
Okay.
From Cardinal Oswald Gracias. And then it goes before the whole bishops' conference early in 2018 and was approved in principle. And then after it was approved in principle, they actually set about preparing the whole lectionary, which takes a lot of work. And that was submitted to the Vatican and approved in December of 2019.
Wow.
So they started using the ESV lectionary on Palm Sunday last year.
Wow. So this is very recent.
Yeah, that's right.
And that triggered the Augustine Institute to say, hey, it's been approved by the Vatican. Great. Now we can start translating it in America, and maybe, just maybe, we will have this translation in our liturgies, you think, maybe?
I don't know about that, right? I mean, our liturgy uses the New American Bible Revised Edition. I don't see us deviating from that anytime soon, but who knows?
But at least we'll have this for our private reading.
Yeah, we can use the ESV for private study and prayer and reflection. I feel like it's such a great grace because, you know, if you've been in the American Catholic English Bible market for a long time, like I have, you really only have three choices, okay? There are three families of translations, right? The RSV, the Jerusalem Bible, and the New American Bible. There really haven't been other choices. Now, there are some like footnotes to that, like the Douay Rheims and the Good News Bible and a couple other things, but really you have three choices. And they're all kind of old and they all have kind of quirks and whatever else. And so the ESV is just like it's like a great option. It's like, wow, all of a sudden we have a fourth option that's really valuable, right? And so I think a lot of Catholic Bible readers will just really appreciate the ESV because, again, it's like fresh and yet familiar at the same time. And like, it's a new translation and yet it feels venerable and elegant and old. So I don't know. I just think that people will really enjoy it.
And real quick, I'm just curious, you mentioned that the NIV was a conservative evangelical response to the RSV that they thought was a little liberal. Yeah. Why did they think that was liberal?
Well, okay, so when the RSV first came out, it was really controversial in American evangelical circles. It's hard for us to remember what American religion was like in the 1940s and 50s, right? Everybody went to church. Everybody went to church. And the most powerful, largest, strongest churches in the United States were the mainline Protestant churches, right? The Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Methodists, you know, as big churches, huge congregations, huge international organizations, and so forth. And those were the churches that sponsored the production of the RSV. The evangelicals, who are not exactly a denomination, right? It's like a sort of ethos that is within the Reformed tradition, the Baptist tradition, the Free Church tradition. They were kind of like not part of the Protestant institution in the United States at that time. And so when the RSV came out, for a lot of people, it was a kind of threat because they've been so accustomed to reading the King James Bible that it was like, what are you doing messing with the Word of God, right? Why are you doing this, right? So like just like this kind of shock of having a new translation was just too much for a lot of people. But the most controversial thing that the RSV did was in Isaiah's prophecy of the virgin birth in Isaiah 7:14. So in the King James Version, it says, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. But as you probably know, there's a kind of a running debate over that word in Hebrew, the word alma. And what does it really mean, virgin, or does it, mean young woman, or what does it mean? And so in the RSV, they translated Isaiah 7:14, a young woman shall conceive. All of the sudden, right, the prophecy of the virgin birth is no longer a prophecy of the virgin birth.
That's awful.
Okay. And so people were scandalized by this. And there were people who were threatening to burn their RSV Bibles, or there was this one preacher who said he was going to burn a Bible, but ended up only ripping out that page and burning the one page, right? But there were people who were just really, really mad about this translation of Isaiah 7:14. So that's one place where the ESV actually reverts right back to the King James against the RSV. So if you read your ESV Bible, it says the virgin shall conceive.
Now, did the RSV ever change it back?
So yeah, in the RSV Second Catholic Edition, yes.
But not the, okay. Wow. Well, that's good that they changed it in the second edition, which is almost a mirror of the ESV, but still different. Wow.
Yeah, so
that
was
is
the
wild.
most controversial thing about the RSV when it first came out. There are other things that are a little bit more detailed and maybe quibbles or whatever, but that one really stood out for people.
Wow. Well, Dr. Giszczak, Dr. G, thank you so much.
I hope that's been helpful. I know there's a lot of letters, a lot of alphabet soup thrown in there. It can get a little confusing.
Well, I told some friends today I was going to do this interview with you, and they wanted me to make sure that you mentioned the BLT translation. The bacon, lettuce, tomato with St. Pita, and lots of puns that can go off that. But
maybe I could just conclude with like a couple positive notes here. Right?
Yes, please.
One of the great hopes for the ESV and the ESV Catholic Edition is that it really could be a common Bible for Catholic and Protestant English speakers, right? It's just really wonderful, right? The ESV is being used by Reformed Christians, by Baptists, by Lutherans. It's being handed out by the Gideons. It's being used by the Anglicans, and now the Catholics can use it.
Yes.
Right? So something really wonderful about having a common Bible that Catholics and Protestants can read together or pray together and quote together. There's something really great about that. And, English is the most widely spoken language on planet Earth. And that's really a really important thing, right? So the secretary for the Congregation of Divine Worship, Archbishop Arthur Roche, likes to say that English is the new Latin, right? Why is that the case? Because English is the most widely spoken language. So it's really important for the church to get the liturgy translation right in English. It's really important for the church, universal, to get the Bible translation right in English. Why is that? Because if you go to smaller countries who are translating the liturgy, right, they're not translating directly from the Latin. They're translating from the English, right? So you've got translation teams in smaller countries, smaller language groups, and their Latin proficiency isn't sufficient to translate directly from the Latin. And so they're usually using the English as the basis. So it's really important that the English is really good.
Wow.
And this idea that the Bible in English has to be a kind of elevated or elegant English, I think some people poo-poo is like, oh, well, that's kind of old-fashioned. You don't really need that. We can use colloquial English and this sort of thing. I think an elegant and elevated English is actually really important for the liturgy, precisely because English is the most widely spoken language, right? If you've got people from around the world in many different countries using the same Bible translation, right, in English, and maybe even learning how to pray or learning how to speak English using this Bible translation, you want it to be very accurate, very good literary English, not colloquial English.
Yes.
So Cardinal Gracias, right, who's the sort of head of the bishops in India, who really was the spearhead of the project to produce the ESV Catholic edition, likes to say that the ESV is the Church of India's gift to the universal church. And I really think that's true, right? That we're all being blessed by this new Bible translation that the Indian church was able to bring to publication. And I think we'll be grateful for it for a long time to come.
Wow. And just a plug-in for one of the versions of the ESV that the Augustine Institute's put out is the Bible in a Year.
Yeah.
ESV Catholic edition that just like goes by day, and you can read the whole Bible in a year, which includes what some would call the Apocrypha, others would call the Deuterocanonical text, others would call canon, the 7 books. But it's cool that like there's even like versions like that where it's like, if you want to read the Bible in a year, here you go. And for me, I'm super excited about this because I grew up memorizing scripture from the ESV, and so I had to transition to the RSV, which was hard. And so I'm excited to transition back to the ESV. And I see a lot of great things in the future because of this translation, for me personally, at least, and for the world. Like, I think you're dead on right about that.
Yeah. And so we've produced paperback, leather, and hardback versions of the ESV Catholic edition. You can get them at catholicbible.org. If you want an electronic edition, there's only one right now through the Verbum Bible software. It's $9.99, so you can get an electronic edition as well. And like you said, there's also the Bible in a Year. So there are several different ways you can get access to the ESV text and start using it for prayer and study.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. G. Appreciate you, man. And thanks for coming on and explaining this. This is complicated, but you did such a fantastic job of making it coherent. And I feel like I learned a ton just by talking with you today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always happy to talk about the Bible.
Yes. And where can people find your work?
So you can find me at my blog, catholicbiblestudent.com. I've been blogging there since 2006. I have a handful of YouTube videos, a podcast I did a couple years ago, and but I have a lot of new lectures and things that are available at my website. If you take a look at catholicbiblestudent.com.
All right. Thank you, Dr. G.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up where knowledge takes flight.